Okay, so welcome. So my name is Marieke. We're going to start off with a topic which is global migration and refugees. One thing you should know is that actually there's very few management scholars that are doing scientific research on this question. So I think we have managed to bring some of the top scholars here, and I'm so very excited that we can bring them all together and that we can have a conversation with them. So let me actually just introduce him and call our speakers to the stage. So Anselm Hager is from Humboldt University. Okay, so and he'll be talking about his research in Lebanon, and so his research is very micro. It's very behavioral. It's about what does it take to integrate Syrian refugees into the Lebanese society. So he will be focusing actually on social capital and the connections that refugees make. So it's really the topic of integration. Then I also want to call to the floor Moussa. So Moussa is one of my heroes also. So he's been doing work on refugee camps. So it's a completely different angle. So he's looking at organizations, what's the kind of organization, how can we understand the organization of refugee camps, okay? And so he's been doing a lot of ethnographic research on the biggest refugee camp in the world. So he will tell us about this. So Moussa is actually in Rotterdam, but he is going to move to SMU, to Singapore Management University. So Moussa, I propose you take a seat here and we let the ensemble kick us off. And then finally Sandra, together with Dan, and there's a really interesting community at the Columbia Business School who's doing amazing work on entrepreneurship and thinking more about how do undocumented migrants actually integrate into society, focusing on the channel of entrepreneurship. And so she will tell us some really interesting, again, more qualitative, based on a lot of qualitative interviews, and what are the strategies that undocumented entrepreneurs use to kind of override some of the stigma, social stigma that they may encounter in their context. In this case, it's California, USA. So very excited to have the kind of mixture of perspectives on a topic, as Loïc and Benedict already mentioned, is one of the topics that is here to stay. The whole movement of people is a mega trend that is going to shape our society in the years to come. So I'm very excited that we have researchers already today who are grappling with the topic and who are helping us make sense of it and help us engage with it. So, and then just to top it off, we do have also Raphaël Thirion from ADECO, who's going to just listen. So she's been working with refugees, helping businesses integrate refugees, so accompanying the process of matching refugees with employment opportunities, and so accompanying that both on the side of companies, so preparing companies to welcome refugees, and also helping refugees connect with companies. So very interesting work. And so her role is really just to listen and then sort of share with us what resonates with her reality, what kinds of ideas does she find useful, can she add on to, and so very pleased to have your spontaneous expertise here with us. So we have 15-minute presentations, and I will be your timekeeper. Okay, so I have 5 minutes and 2 minutes, and then we'll try to respect. We're doing a very good job, I think, already respecting the calendar. Okay, so off to you. Cool. And yeah. I think you don't need this. I think this will work.
Yes. Okay. Cool. Whoops. Sorry, I'm very tall.
This is a clicker if you want. Okay, let me sit.
Can I use this mic? Is it possible?
Yes, of course.
Because I tend to. Does it work?
It works. Please.
I tend to walk around a lot. Thanks very much to all of you for coming and for organizing this. I think it's fantastic to have these kinds of settings where us researchers interact with NGOs and policymakers, et cetera, to sort of get us out of the ivory tower into sort of more practical worlds. And that's what I like about business schools in general, because I'm actually not at a business school, although I do some management stuff. That you really have this sort of close connection, which is quite nice. So I'm Anselm Hager. I'm based in Berlin at Humboldt University, and it's a joint project with Justin Walasek, who's at Bergen. And it's a project that will take us to Lebanon and ask a question, namely whether exposure to refugees has any effect on pro-social behavior. What do we mean by pro-social behavior? It's essentially behavior that has the interest of all in mind. We operationalize this usually with trust and social giving and these kinds of things, but sort of, pro-social behavior, which really underpins social capital, social cohesion, all these nice words that we try to foster in society. Now, the setting is northern Lebanon, and why are we looking at northern Lebanon? Well, as you may know, it's a setting that has a lot of migration, a lot of refugees, and it's really a laboratory to ask many questions that we're interested in this field. And what did we do in the project? Well, we did a big population level survey, and then when you use sort of a whole bunch of statistical things, which I'm not going to bore you with too much, to then yield a finding, namely, which is quite positive, so I get to sort of start us off with a positive, I guess, note, that exposure to refugees seems to foster pro-social behavior. So it's good, in other words, if people are exposed to refugees. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to argue today, and let's see if I can convince you. Quick background on Lebanon. I think these 3 maps are quite staggering, and they show just the increase of refugees in the country. I mean, Lebanon is just a fascinating country in general, and one big thing is just how many refugees they host. And this is, of course, a general thing that most refugees are actually housed in the global south, not in Western countries, even though the media and some politicians may portray this very differently. And so, yeah, that's essentially what we're looking at. And the other thing that I want you to notice is that over here, it's actually a French map, lucky me, carte du relief. Lebanon has very interesting sort of topographic features, and we're going to use that to estimate the effects of exposure to refugees on pro-social behavior, because refugees tend to settle in different areas, and not everywhere, essentially, is sort of the conceptual idea in the paper. Now, what did we do? We ran a big population level survey. This is northern Lebanon. This is Syria. We drew a whole bunch of data from censuses, created these small quadrants that you see, and then we took a random sample of the Lebanese population and also of the Syrian population. I'm going to focus on the Lebanese population, on the host population today, because that's the, I think, most interesting question, but I can talk more about this in the Q&A. And then send people out. This was a face-to-face survey, so it took quite some time, but I think it yielded a pretty nice sample. And then we played a couple of sort of behavioral games with them, and this is how we measure social cohesion or pro-social behavior, which maybe this is helpful to some of you as you do sort of M&E and these kinds of things. How do we measure these things? Well, we implement a couple of games, they're called. Perhaps the most important, I would argue, is the trust game. So the way it works, I give you, $10, and then I ask you, how much would you like to give to the next respondent of those $10? And if that respondent gives any money back to you, we'll triple that amount, okay? So it's this idea that I take money, I give it to someone else, and there might be a positive return. It's going to be tripled, but you don't quite know if the other person is going to send it back. So you might lose everything, or you might triple your investment. So it's a nice measure of trust, which really is to sort of put your trust into someone else to hopefully make the right decision and send some back and yield to a social surplus. There were some other measures on altruism, which we usually just measure with giving. Are you willing to give money to someone else? Reciprocity and cooperation. I don't want to talk about it too much, but the idea being we have these 4 measures, 4 concepts that really, in the sort of debate, I would say, constitute what we call pro-social behavior. I'm sure there's more, but those are 4 big ones. And then we implemented them in a survey. Usually, what people have done is actually play these lab games, as they're called. These days, there's quite nice research that shows it's sufficient to just ask it in a hypothetical survey. So you don't actually have to go through the pains of implementing, giving someone money, giving it to someone else, seeing if they send anything back. You can just ask, hypothetically, would they do it? And it yields exactly the same results, so that's quite nice, and we've made some progress there to really implement these measures more quickly. And then how do we measure pro-social behavior? Well, we randomized whether this trust, that is to say a Lebanese person investing in someone else or sending money to someone else, whether that other person, that recipient, is either Syrian, which is the refugee outgroup, Lebanese, or, interestingly enough, Palestinians. Because the interesting thing about the setting is that there are, of course, already existing migrants, namely Palestinians. And this is something that you have in many settings across the world. Some might argue, the world's just a whole bunch of migration over the centuries and et cetera, et cetera. So you have an existing migrant group, and then a new flood of refugees in this case comes to the country. And so there's all these interesting spillover effects that one can analyze. What do we do? Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the statistical shenanigans, but we have a whole bunch of things, including one experiment toward the end. And the essential idea is that we check how close do Lebanese residents, so the host population, live to refugee shelters. And then we see, is there a correlation, it's a bit more fancy than that, but is there a correlation between being closer to refugees and pro-social behavior? Or might it be that the correlation is actually negative, which again is what the media might imply at times, that there's tensions once you are housed next to refugees. So what do we find? Here's the sort of main finding. And this is just a simple regression with a whole bunch of control variables for those of you that are more anointed. We find the following. If you live closer to a refugee camp as a Lebanese host population, you become more pro-social towards Syrians. So apparently, living closer to refugees makes you trust them more, reciprocate more, be more altruistic, etc. So quite a nice increase by 0.1 standard, a little bit less than 0.1 standard deviations. It does not change your reaction or your pro-social behavior toward your own in-group. So it's not the case that somehow you become more pro-social toward Syrians, but less pro-social toward your own group. So there's no sort of crowding out effect. And, which I think is quite interesting, there seems to be some positive spillover to existing migrants, okay? So these are Palestinians in this case. So being closer to a refugee camp seems to increase pro-social behavior. Quite interesting, and there's a positive spillover effect, and I think that's the one that's most interesting. So there's no sort of aggregate shift downward for the Lebanese population, there's a positive increase for Syrians, and a positive increase for Palestinians. Interesting. Now this looks exactly the same way to those in the room that are more statistically inclined. If we instrument, we use some, so the issue of course is that the settlement of refugees might not be random. So some of you in the room that are very critical, kind of consultant type, what if the refugees are all housed to people that are more pro-social to begin with, right, somehow? I don't think it makes a ton of sense in northern Lebanon because there's the UN and they house people, and it's not that they would somehow know which Lebanese are more pro-social, but whatever. If that's the case, how can we sort of get around that? And what we do is what's called an instrumental variable. And we use the fact, if you go back to the map over here, this map, that refugees are really never housed in the higher up mountains. Okay, so this doesn't happen. So you'll always see this thing. So you can use altitude as an instrument for exposure to refugees, sort of like a random outside variable, if you will. So if we do that, results look pretty much the same. Again, you see an uptick in pro-social behavior towards Syrians, uptick toward Palestinians, no effect on the Lebanese. Third thing we do, also gets at this, is a geographic discontinuity design. And the idea here is that this is the sort of the mountain range, and there's almost no refugees housed there. So we can sort of have this sort of natural experiment, if you will. We compare Lebanese people that live here to those that live here. In this valley, people are exposed to refugees. Over here, they're not. And then the people that are very close to the border are very similar, but some are exposed to refugees on the one side, on the other side, you're not. So it's, again, like a natural experiment. And we see similar effects. So overall, if you are exposed to refugees, there's a positive effect. It's not always statistically significant because the sample size goes down. But it's always there. And if you go closer to the cutoff where sort of it's a more plausible comparison group, you also see a positive effect. Again, not perfectly precisely measured, it's just the way it is in these kinds of settings. It only becomes significant if you increase this bandwidth of people on the one side versus the other side to roughly 10 kilometers. Okay, let me actually, in the interest of time, get to perhaps the more interesting question, or the more relevant for many in the room, which is why is that the case, right? So assume you believe what I just showed you. that exposure to refugees increases prosociality, so trust, et cetera, et cetera. Why is that? Now, there's lots of theories out there why contacts with an outgroup might yield to positive outcomes. And one, as I just mentioned, is actually contact. So I'm sure you've heard of the sort of contact hypothesis, Allport 1954. And there the idea is you really want to put people in contact, and that leads to many positive things. Now, Allport has a whole bunch of conditions, so clearly it's not going to be this simple that it's just contact. He talks about like it's got to be at the same level, there's got to be some authority endorsement, et cetera, et cetera. But the essential idea is if you put people in contact, if they just get to know one another, that'll reduce sort of negative prejudice and might build trust and altruism and these kinds of things. So just contact, okay? The second thing, and this is a theory we had before we actually collected the data. This is quite important, I think, that you don't theorize after you see the data, even though that's done an awful lot, but you put down your thoughts beforehand. The second mechanism we had in mind is actually negative. That's something you hear about quite a bit, is that there's some sort of cultural threat. Now that, of course, would imply you do not see an uptick in pro-social behavior, but you see a downward tick. That makes sense, a decrease. Now, why might that be the case? Well, Syrians are different than Lebanese. Looking from the West, you might say, well, they're all Muslim, but that's not how it works because there's lots of Christians in Lebanon, et cetera. And, culture is a complicated thing, so there might still be cultural threat. There was, of course, a war going on. So it could have been the case that exposure to refugees really has a negative effect on pro-social behavior because it raises cultural threat, okay? And again, we're finding an uptick here. So why do I show you this mechanism? Well, looking at these data in a second, I don't want this to go up, because if this goes up, this doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make the data very plausible, right? And the first mechanism is resources. So it might be the case that exposure to refugees somehow changes the sort of resource economy. There's different mechanisms, sub-mechanisms here that might be operating. So it could be the case that there's actually labor market competition, which would be a negative mechanism. But it could also be that refugees, well, they bring financial resources. They tend to be housed, in this case, by the UN. There's a new labor market, new opportunities to sell goods and services, et cetera, et cetera. So there could be sort of an economic channel. So I should warn you, these are very broad channels, okay? They're not very precise, just because life's complicated. And you could drill this down, and there's nice research on contact that would sort of really spell out further conditions, why it might matter, but let's look at these three big ones. And what do we see? Interesting. We see that contact is positively affected. So it seems to be that contact, inter-ethnic conflict between Lebanese and Syrians, is one plausible mechanism that drives the positive relationship between exposure and pro-social behavior. There's no effect on cultural threat, which we measure with a feeling thermometer. I can get into the details in a second, but it may not be necessary. And there is a decrease in perceived scarcity. So resources are not negatively affected. If anything, they're positively affected if you are exposed to refugees. Now, I should caution in this setting, okay? This is northern Lebanon. This is not the entire world. This is one specific setting, but one study at a time. It's the way it goes. Okay, so I guess I'm almost out of time. So we do seem to find a positive association between refugees and pro-social behavior. That's quite nice. In Lebanon, between Lebanese host population and Syrian outgroups. There seems to be a positive spillover to other migrants, which is quite nice. So I'm thinking of, I'm from Germany, and it's quite interesting to see now the Ukrainians come into Germany, what effect that has on existing migrant groups. So is there any positive spillover? So this is a salient policy debate, and in this case, there does seem to be. Why is there this positive association? We think that contact is really quite important. So you just put in contact, which reduces all sorts of stereotypes, prejudice, etc. There doesn't seem to be an increase in scarcity. If anything, it actually goes down, perceived scarcity, which may have to do with sort of institutional support, which seems quite important. And the other thing that I'll just want to leave you with, which I think is quite interesting, is just to think about migration a little bit more broadly. What is quite specific about Lebanon is that it's a country of migration. So I want you to keep that in mind because I'm curious what these results would look like in a country that has less of a migration history. Lebanon is a huge sort of migrant hotspot. So I'm curious what you think about other settings. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Marike, for inviting me. And also thank you, the team, who have been working to put us all together. So my name is SM Musa. You can call me Musa. I am a PhD candidate at Rotterdam School of Management, and I've been working basically doing field work in a refugee camp to understand how camp works and what does camp do to the refugees. Now, my presentation has a different title, a little bit bigger title, which is Institutional Totalization, Securitization, Resource Mobilization in a Refugee Camp. Now, why I put institutional totalization because this is the focus. So think about the institution you are living in or working in, right? And how much control does it have on your life, right? And to give you an example of like total institutions, institution is prison, right? Prison controls the prisoners in every possible way. Now, what is the relationship between prison and refugee camp, right? That's what I was surprised when I was doing field work in Bangladesh. I'm originally from Bangladesh, so it was easy to spend time there. Now, how a refugee camp become a prison-like, right? So most of the refugees I talk, they always think prison, refugee camp as open prison, right? And then I asked, or my team asked basically, how does that happen? What has been done in camp context that gives them a feeling of being in prison, right? That is what I will be doing. I had many slides and photos. I had to get rid of them to keep it a little bit sharp. So let's see if it works. Oh. So before going into the actual finding, let me talk a little bit about Rohingya crisis. Because of a lot of crises, sometimes we forget the crisis that happened 5 years back or 6 years back, right? So Rohingya crisis happened in 2017. It has been, Rohingyas are basically Burmese Muslim population living in Myanmar, and they have been facing discrimination for last 70 years when the Britishers left the country. But actual tragedy happened the real tragedy happened in 2017 when they were forced to leave the country and take shelter in Bangladesh, nearby, just other side of the border. Now, currently, about 1 million Rohingyas are living in Kutupalong refugee camp. Just to give you a little bit of visuals, so this is how their houses were burned down by, the security forces, local communities. So you can see the dark side of humanity or human civilization. Now, they were forced to escape their villages, and this is where they are living now. This is in Bangladesh, in Chittagong division near Cox's Bazar, which is a beach city. But now this whole area is more famous for hosting the largest refugee population. So this is the largest refugee camp in the world. And just to give you a little bit of figure, almost 1 million refugees living. There are 34 camps clustered into 2 different groups. Kutupalong is the larger one, and I did my field work mostly there. Now, as I mentioned, so I started my fieldwork in 2019, and over the time I realized that camp is becoming more total, meaning camp is becoming more prison-like, right? So the question is, how can a humanitarian space become like a total institution, like a prison, right? And that is like the exploratory question we had. And in exploring this question, we have some finding that I will present here. And most importantly, there are some questions to think about mostly. So I don't have a solution here. I don't have a claim to make, except some interaction between refugees and institutional authorities. But that lead us to a lot of questions, especially for the policymaker, particularly NGOs, like who are dealing with the refugee and refugee crisis. Now, as I mentioned, it's an ethnographic study of Kutupalong refugee camp. I have been in camp 14 months. I lived there in 4 months inside the camp and outside of the camp. This paper particularly is based on 12 months of field work in 3 different phases. So yeah, so what I do, sorry. Oh, okay. So I wanted to tell a little bit about like the methodology, right? So I use observation, of course, and then ethnographic interview, and then of course, a lot of secondary data. But these are the key findings. Probably Nature wanted the findings first. So we have 3 type of observation. One is how refugee camp become a total institution from a very humanitarian space or organization, right? And we find that bureaucratization, dehumanization, and securitization, these are the processes. I will walk you through a little bit on that. And against these processes, I think the reaction that happened the refugees reacted. So what happened? Yeah. So against bureaucratization, this is a difficult word, and this is the country who invented the words, right? So against bureaucracy, the refugees, what they do, they try to work toward their community, restore their community that they lost when they fled the country, right? And when dehumanization happens, what happens that they start counter-organizing. And once securitization takes place, they try to resist. Now, I will tell you how that happened and how that is possible. What we call, I made a mistake there, bootstrapping behaviors. So marshalling, indigenizing, and potentiating. Let me walk you through a little bit rather than talking about that. So this is the conceptual model usually we need to put in paper, but the ultimate finding is like this. So to manage the crisis, a bureaucratic system was necessary, right? And no one can argue against that probably. But this bureaucracy comes with a lot of demand on efficiency, right? And efficiency requires probably docile body, right? So the bodies that you can control to do whatever you plan, right? And that lead to dehumanizing condition, meaning you need to restrict the behavior of the refugees, you need to restrict what they can do and what they cannot do, right? And gradually, even to maintain this bureaucratic system and dehumanizing situation, you also need to create more macro political narrative of insecurity, right? So most of the time we hear the refugees are a problem, and they, for example, in Bangladesh, they are considered as drug traders because they're bringing drug from different, basically other side of the border and bring it in Bangladesh. They are killing each other and they are becoming terrorists, right? So gradually this securitization happened, and that ultimately sustained this bureaucratic system through the process of also dehumanizing. So these are the process. So for example, this community is very conservative, right? But because of bureaucratic system, the women who don't have any male member in the family have to go to collect this cylinder, right? So there is no alternative. You have to go. Then, of course, because of the securitization, you even separate between them, right? So to protect the community, the host community, to protect the future of their own community, they try to restrict their movement even within the camp context. Now, the reaction that I talked about, of course, I mean, human nature is to react, right? No matter how difficult. Even prisoners in extremely difficult contexts, they also react, right? So refugees, they react. What they did, they started developing their community, right? And Marike, we have been talking about this school, this social civil organization they have found, right? And then, of course, what they do, to sustain their community restoration program, they also need to counter-organize. So counter-organize happen basically, one aspect that we see a lot is business activities, right? So one thing that really interesting for me is the organization of Bazaar as a space, as an organization, meaning the marketplace as an counter institution in a way, and how that helps them to sustain their community restoration program, right? And resistance is not the resistance that probably comes in our mind. Resistance is basically resisting some of the direction of the authorities, right? For example, there was a time when they were forced to leave the camp, or they were forced to move to another island camp, and they resisted that. And they resisted a lot of repatriation effort because their citizenship was not guaranteed, right? So this kind of quite not that harmful resistance are there, but at some point, if everything goes well with their community restoration, counter-organizing, probably resistance will be more in coming years. Now, how that is happen? So this bootstrapping behavior, resource mobilization, and we have, so just to briefly, initially they focus more into organizing, repurposing their community resources. And then at the later stage, what they do, they try to connect with international organization, their diaspora, try to bring more resources, which is more potentiating. They use creativity, art as a space to build up a lot of their resource and network, and also at some point to build some resistance to the authority. So, as I mentioned, we don't have good news. What we have is some question. The question is to maintain refugee camp or such system, you need to develop opportunity structure, opportunity space, right? But what we have observed that this focus more on creating a new elite within the community. Some of the refugees, they work, which is really great, right? 10% of the refugee household in Kutupalong have someone working for NGOs. And these 10% probably are the instrument of the authorities or NGOs to maintain the peace and stability, right? So to maintain their program, keep going, right? So this new elite is really positive, but the dark side is that these are the people also taking everything comes from authority as it is. They're not questioning, right? So they also balance out the resistance from the community as well. So they, in a way, they are institutional parasite. There is a term, meaning they help the institutional authorities to sustain the system, right? But I don't have any negative perception about NGOs recruiting refugees, and it is much necessary, right? But we just need to think about how we can expand the opportunity structure that not only limit to 10% in our case, right? Can we extend it to make a little bit bigger, more accessible for even uneducated refugees? These 10% are mostly the educated ones. Then the question of efficiency and dignity, right? So the tendency of NGOs, for all good reason, for NGO, one disclaimer is, what I have observed, NGOs are the people, NGOs are the institution who are helping the refugees to survive, to have some future life project themselves, right? But at the same time, over the time, they become instrument of the government. So the question is how to avoid that, right? And one way they tend to do that, not the avoiding part, tend to act on behalf of government is like taking total control of the camp activities, meaning they want to run a school, they want to run the civil organization, they want to do everything. So it's more like project-oriented approach, right? What does it take away is the opportunity to self-organize, right? So a dignified life often depends on the ability to self-organize. For example, we are self-organizing on a purpose, right? Sometimes NGOs, with all the good intention, they want to take control of all camp activities, right? And that we need to reconsider whether we can think differently a little bit. So the third and final question that I already talked a little bit, most of the NGOs and NGO activities are very project-oriented, right? So they get funded, they run the project every year. Next year, they need to get more funding, or probably same funding. To do that, they always focus on efficiency and total control, right? The question is, can we think of alternative approach, which is not very project-focused, which is more focusing on developing refugees and their future, right? So these are the questions I had based on this study, and I would love to hear your opinion. If you have any question, of course, we have a session for that. Thank you so much.
Okay, so as Sandra gets ready, I actually forgot to mention Sandra is going to join the LSE very soon. So she's moving from New York to London, and so we are actually very excited. We think you want to be closer to us, and you'll hopefully see more.
That would be lovely. Thank you. Okay, so just have to find my slides here, or?
Let me help you, sorry.
Thank you.
You can use the clicker.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandra Portocarrero, and I'm a postdoctoral scholar in the management division at Columbia Business School. And today I'm going to present one of the projects that Dan Wan, who's in the audience and who you'll hear from later. I'm going to use this then. I don't like holding microphone. I like dropping mics, but not holding them. Yeah, anyway. Today I'm going to present one of the projects that Dan Wan and I are working on. This is one of the studies that emerges from our qualitative and quantitative data set. It's a data set that we've put together along with, in partnership with Immigrants Rising, an organization working with undocumented entrepreneurs in the United States. So today's project is about redemption through entrepreneurship, how entrepreneurial status can override a stigmatized immigrant status. So despite all the negative things that people say about undocumented entrepreneurs actually contribute a lot to the US economy. They also create new markets, innovate, they just have all these positive contributions. Through federal taxes, state and local taxes, they have contributed billions of dollars to the US economy in the past decades. And despite of all of these contributions, there is still a negative stigma attached to undocumented people. Some people call them illegals, others claim that undocumented people are taking jobs from US citizens. But it takes courage to start a new life or to cross a border, right, and start a new life in a foreign country. And it also takes courage to start a new business, as we know. In countries like the United States, being an entrepreneur is perceived as something that is culturally trendy and cool, something that is worth of admiration. And one of the things that we're finding in this study is that undocumented people choose to become entrepreneurs not just because there is the opportunity to make money or to make a living, but also because of the barriers that undocumented people face in society. Because of these negative connotations, undocumented people have found that through entrepreneurship, they might be able to go up the social ladder or social status. And this is how we're framing our study, right? There's a lot of studies that show that entrepreneurship becomes a viable option for people who hold stigmatized identities, like the work of Damon Phillips and Kylie Huang, with formerly incarcerated entrepreneurs. But we are looking at the social aspects of entrepreneurship and how it can help people achieve a type of what we think of redemption and override a stigmatized immigrant status. Now, the good news is that, as you can see on the screen, there are many organizations in the United States working with undocumented people to help them start their new businesses and just start their new ventures. So with all of this data that we are analyzing, and these are preliminary findings, we come to this question: how does becoming an entrepreneur allow migrants in vulnerable situations to override a stigmatized social status? And if we think of our case in particular, the migrants in vulnerable situations will be the undocumented entrepreneurs, and the stigmatized social status will be being undocumented. But think about other types of migrants as well in society. So to understand what are the conditions that allow for this to happen, for undocumented people to become entrepreneurs, we are using different types of framework that will help us understand these conditions, specifically focusing on the social part, of this study. So we know that undocumented people are marginalized and relegated to a low status position in society, right? They call them illegal. Trump used to call them bad hombres, etc. We also know that undocumented people usually are caught in situations of precarious work. They experience wage theft, they are paid under the table, meaning that they're paying cash, they do not have benefits, and they end up working in jobs that simply exploit them. And then, despite what we think about social networks and ethnic networks helping people from the same background, more and more research shows that people in immigrant networks can be a source of support, but also a sort of constraint. In our study, we're finding people that are, Latinos taking advantage of other Latinos, or Asian Americans taking advantage of Asian immigrants, etc. So thinking of all of these and thinking of all this framework, again, we're trying to answer, how does becoming an entrepreneur allow migrants in vulnerable situations to override a stigmatized social status? And to do that, we draw from the qualitative part of our data set. We analyze data coming from 41 interviews with undocumented entrepreneurs and 9 interviews with formerly undocumented entrepreneurs. And what you see on the screen is just a screenshot of the program that we use to code our qualitative data, which is NVivo. And it allows us to just group our data in different codes, themes, etc. It's pretty cool. But we also triangulated our interview data to responses to 119 applications to a seed grant funded by the state of California. So let me explain this a bit. I started the presentation by telling you that we partnered with Immigrants Rising. And Immigrants Rising is this organization that the state of California selected to administer grants that are either $5,000 or $10,000 to entrepreneurs that are migrants, not all undocumented, but migrants. So we actually have access to the applications for this seed grant that help us understand the motivation behind starting this new venture, and just a bunch of data and different variables that allows us to understand who are these people applying to these grants. So even though we have access to 1,001 applications, we triangulated the data to only 819 applications because these 819 people are undocumented and not formally undocumented or US residents, for example. And this is kind of in a nutshell what we found. We found that undocumented entrepreneurs kind of override their stigmatized, undocumented people, sorry, kind of override their stigmatized status through entrepreneurship. And we try to organize our data in 3 different phases. So you can see roughly here, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So phase 1 is being an undocumented person. You hold a low status due to the stigmatized immigrant status. You experience marginalization, precarious work, and ethnic cage. So in the first part of our process, we are grouping all of the data we have under these experiences. Oops, sorry. And let me just show you some quotes that we extracted from our data that depict this process. So one of our participants, a consultant, talking about being marginalized, he said, "According to many people, I was outstanding in school and I could achieve many great things academically. But I left everything because I didn't feel like I had the opportunity because of documents or being undocumented. It caught my attention how many people like me left school for the same reasons. And as a human being, in my case, it was very difficult for me to share my emotions at that time. Because even though I was smart, I know that people look at me as if I was a criminal because I didn't have papers. I have heard diminishing comments in the news, but also in the classroom." Now, to talk about precarious work, or to depict precarious work, we selected this quote to show it to you today. So one of our participants, an advertisement entrepreneur, said, "Before I started my business, it was very difficult to get a job because I didn't have documents. When I was young, and it has been a while since I arrived in the United States, I always liked technology and computers, and I was very good. And for the only jobs that I was limited to do when I was in high school to take money to spend was to work in restaurants like McDonald's. I came to work in a golf field, cleaning the grass, and I came to work in a car wash. But most of the jobs where I had opportunities without checking my documents were in restaurants, and I got paid little with no benefits." These are verbatim transcriptions from the interviews that we conducted. And this quote depicts the ethnic cage, right? The fact that your ethnic networks can build bridges, but also constrain. So one of the clothing entrepreneurs that participated in our study said, "The truth is, I didn't receive much support from my community. It's almost like, no. It's all been for myself. And I have thought about hiring services so that they can help me a little. They also they taught us, referring to the organizations they work with. But no, my community has not been very helpful. Sometimes the opposite, like taking advantage of my situation to do free work at their homes." Now, after experiencing marginalization, precarious work, and feeling like their community can really help them, we found that undocumented people start developing this desire to gain respect and identifying entrepreneurship as culturally trendy and admirable. So they become entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship can allow them to feel a type of redemption. This is Chris Mercado, one of our participants, who we also had the honor of hosting at Columbia Business School a few months ago in one of our inclusive entrepreneurship workshops. He is the founder and CEO of Grand Answers. Please Google it and follow him on Instagram. And Chris shared, "Growing a business gave me what my immigrant status took away for so long. Financial security, a decent place to live, and a sense that my talent is treasured. Entrepreneurship became my empowerment. And I'm one of many examples that being paperless does not mean you are powerless." And then finally, we find that undocumented people, because they become entrepreneurs, they gain this high status in their networks and in society due to the entrepreneurial status. So the high status is linked to their entrepreneurial status. They start getting access to capital from organizations and investors. They get community recognition, and they achieve some sort of redemption through entrepreneurship. And these are some quotes that depict this sentiment of experiencing redemption through entrepreneurship. One of our advertisement entrepreneurs participants said, "If I could give a piece of advice to an immigrant who wants to start a business, take that opportunity as option number 1 before looking for a job. Because despite the fact that there are many obstacles in entrepreneurship, there's also a lot of learning. And if you're creative and look for solutions, you can find them. And apart from that, in this business, it gives you time. It gives you freedom of time to do things that are, for example, your dreams, or keep yourself better in a hobby, or sometimes you actually have those days when you don't actually take a day off, like having a day off, so you can also do it. Even if you don't abuse it, you can have those days, but it gives you time to get to know your family better. One of our participants, who is a consultant, a Latina woman, said, there is an organization called Immigrants Rising. We had a grant from them. I don't remember what it's called, but it's for business owners who are undocumented. They had given us a lot of resources through the process. In fact, they gave us $10,000 for Valley Impact 2 years ago. So they're growing and they have a lot of resources. She is the founder of a political strategy firm in the Valley in California. And she's one of the people that makes one of the highest revenues from our data set through an S Corp, a C Corp, and an NGO. And then one of our participants, influencer and public speaker, actually her name is Sarah Mora, if you want to follow her on Instagram too, and she's okay with sharing her name, she shared. I began to organize for free and do a lot of digital strategy work for organizations that I believed in. And then I ran for president of a national space that helps youth, and I got elected. I was the first undocumented person they had elected the first time they were doing a youth program. And I was like, wow, my mind is blown. I genuinely didn't think I was going to get elected because I was undocumented. And then I was in office for a year. I did digital strategy, talks online, started to go viral, hit more numbers through CNN and a bunch of different big platforms. And that was the first time that I started to see people call me an influencer and a leading voice. One of our participants, a winery owner, also shared, there's something in me that has found a passion and a calling in making wine. So I just think that if I was to stop making wine, I think I will be disappointed and I will be sad. And I have a lot of supporters who will be sad to see me not continue on my path. So they will be disappointed too. It's nice to get recognition. I feel loved by my community. So what can we learn from this project in the minute that we have left? Well, from a practical perspective, we can see that entrepreneurship offers a type of redemption for marginalized folks who occupy a low status in society due to their immigrant status. And an idea is to continue studying this type of entrepreneurship to reframe how we think about this population, right? To kind of rethink this negative stigma, how to expand new markets, because there are a lot of people that are customers in these ventures, and learn from this population, learn their strategies, etc. And from a theoretical perspective, because I am an academic, we developed this concept of status override. Entrepreneurial status can override a stigmatized immigrant status, and we fill a gap in the management literature. There are 0 papers published about undocumented entrepreneurship in the top management journals. And I think that's very limiting to our theorizing of entrepreneurship. So thank you very much.
I will. 15 minutes it is. Well, hello. Well, as I am the spontaneous part of the panel, I don't have a slide deck, but boy, did I take notes during your amazing interventions. So I am deeply thrilled to be here today to hear about your research, your work, your approaches. It is amazing. My name is Raphaël Thirion, I am French and I live in Paris, and I am an operating manager at the Adecco Group. I am no researcher, I am a person in the field, and I've been working at the Adecco Group for 9 years now. I've been in finance, I've been in transformation, I've been in marketing digital, and for 5 years now, I've been working at one of the Adecco Group's business unit in France called Humando. And our core business, our core mission at Humando is to provide support and to find jobs and to train people that are far away from employment. Long-term unemployed people, former convicts, refugees, isolated women, and so on. This is the candidates we approach and we deal with. And this is very specific to France. This is very specific to our group in France. And within Humando, I have been managing for 5 years now the refugee expertise. How to make people under the refugee status collaborators, how to train them, how to find jobs, how to convince companies to hire them, how to help them to shift their life and build their life in this country that they have chosen to live in. So basically, this is our job. To give you an idea, Humando, we deal with like 4,000 people, temp workers, most of it, per year, including 1,000 refugees per year. And we have built many dedicated programs these last years. And everything you said in your previous approaches and presentations resonates strongly with what I can observe on the field with my teams and with my clients' teams and with our institutional partners' teams as well. So I will just give you an idea, a quick one, because I'm on time, a quick one about how we work, how we do things. We'll take this one. Hello? Wonderful. And then rebound about what you were saying previously. Basically, at the Adecco Group, and then thus at Humando, our core business is employment. Okay, we provide HR solutions for a number of companies who need to recruit, who need to train, who need resources, skills, and so on and so on. Okay, and it means that we are to deal with, and this is what is so interesting, I find, with this exact point of balance between economic issues and social issues. Companies, they must find people to work on their plant, in their offices. Refugees, they must find work to build a life, okay? And we are here in the middle to make them meet, to make this meeting possible. And this is what's interesting. And we do it through a number of things. We do it through training, we do it through social support, a whole lot of social support, because we talked about vulnerabilities, and there are many vulnerabilities. First, I would like to say that we are dealing exclusively with refugees at the Adecco Group. Refugees, meaning documented refugees, people under the protection of France. Not asylum seekers, only people who are allowed to work on our territory. That's important. And then I would like to say that we deal with people that are very visible in the media, but very invisible in the workplace. So we have to make them visible. And we are asking our client companies to make them visible as well, to be sponsors, to give testimonies about how it works. Because you know what? It works, okay? No one is unemployable. And this is not because you present heavy vulnerabilities that you can't be a good collaborators, and we work on all that. To give you an example, we worked for this company, big group, Suez. I am allowed to name them because they are big sponsors. And they were looking for mechanics, you know, for their environmental dump trucks. And they couldn't find many. They were not happy with how they were sourcing and recruiting. And they were like, okay, we have a strong conviction, strong commitment into integrating people from diversity, and why not refugees, you know? They are very, very active in that field. And we were like, okay, as Yimando, here is what we can propose to you. We can build a whole journey from A to Z, meaning we are going to find refugees depending on certain prerequisites. We are going to source, to recruit. You will have to choose them, and then we are going to train them in apprenticeship. We are going to give them framework of reference as it comes to soft skills. We are going to train them in technical skills and in apprenticeship. And then you will be so convinced and so happy with them that you will hire them indefinitely. And so we did. 12 people under refugee status. Thanks to our partners on the territory, we sourced them, we recruited them, the company selected them, and then we trained them. We trained them in French, I mean, professional vocabulary. They had a basic French level because, I mean, we are an employer. It is temp work, okay, even if it's training, still temp work. We're the employer, and security is paramount, okay? You can't put at work someone who can't read security sentences, or who can't raise a hand saying, hello, there is a problem here, this is not normal. Minimal level of French is necessary to be put in a plant, to be put in a garage, okay? And we train them in, how to say that, in self-confidence, in self-respect, you would say. And this is very, very important because they're entering intensive training, 13 months of training, okay? They need to believe they can do it. And this resonates a lot with what you were saying about believing in oneself and being able to go further than your own fear and the look the people gave you earlier on your own situation. So this is very important. It's not just luxury or nice to have, you know, it's very important, fundamental even. And then, after that, well, this is vocational training. They are trained, theoretical in school and practical on site, at Suez, at the clients, among teams of the clients. And this is also a very important point I will raise later on. And during the whole journey, my team provides total support, total social support. And you have no idea how broad this scope is, how many challenges we can face. It can be administrative, it could be housing, it could be mobility, it could be health, it could be family, it could be trauma, because we talked a lot about vulnerabilities earlier on, but there is something that is most of the time hidden, which is trauma. And you said it, I think, earlier. One of the people you quoted said, I don't dare to share my feelings, my emotions. And most of refugees we meet, they are exactly in that case. They don't share. They are too afraid to be considered vulnerable, to be considered weak, to be excluded because they are weak or because they are trouble, okay? So they don't say anything. And these are little bombs in our journey. So it is very important to deal with all that, because any of these things, they can deeply compromise the journeys. Any of these vulnerabilities, if not treated, if not dealt with, can just scatter everything. So it's very, very important. You talked about, Anselm, I believe, you talked about pro-social behavior, trust, reciprocity, altruism, cooperation, sorry. And I liked the phrase, you might lose everything or you might triple your investment. This is exactly the kind of thing that we tell the client companies we work with. We're like, okay, try it. You might triple your investment. This is investment. This is investing in human resources. This is investing in collaborators who can bring you the triple of what you give them. And most of the time it is true. For example, for the Suez example, the whole cohort, 12 people, get their diploma at the end of the 13 months. The training structure had never seen that, so it was exceptional. And out of 12, 11 were hired after their apprenticeship. And it was very interesting because one of the managers, site manager, said like, okay, one day, you know, we were in the garage and we were dealing with this truck and we were doing this and that, and I'm sorry because technicalities here, no, I can't, but we're doing this and that in the way we always do this and that. And our apprentice, he was like, but why are you doing this? I mean, in my country, we do that, and it's much quicker and more efficient. And they were like, oh my God, he's right. So yeah, they can bring, this is a very, very small story, but it illustrates my point. It can bring so much more in your company, and it does work. So that is something interesting. Any of you told about proximity, contact, and the necessity of contact and proximity in order for some biases to be lightened, to be softened, let's say that. That is so true. And this is something we do a lot with the client companies, with the teams in the field, but also with the institution. You were talking, Moussa, about dehumanization, about bureaucratization. Let me tell you something. We have this, of course, also in France, and not to that level, of course, but for example, all license to stay on the territory, you know. When you're refugees, of course, you have this authorization, but you have to renew it every X month or every X years, okay? And, well, State Department, the prefecture in particular, they are as efficient as they can be, but sometimes, well, they are late in their work, and it can be absolutely catastrophic, because if this renewal is not made on the right time, well, we just have to stop. We can't hire them anymore. It's just a gap in the journey. And it can be a 1-day gap, a 2-day gap, and we had 3 months gap. 3 months gap. The collaborator, he can't go to training, can't go to work, he can't pay his rent, he can pay his food, it's just catastrophic. And we have to fight for it not to be. And for the prefecture, it's only mainly, you know, paperwork. And for us, it's not. For us, it is lives who can be shattered in the middle of a journey. And what we do to lower dehumanization in that bureaucratic way of doing things, we call. I mean, we are a bit pushy here, but we call le préfet, we call sous-préfet, we call the administrative services, we stand in offices, I have teams doing sitting until they have the right paperwork. We invite them to events and victories. You know, we celebrate victories, we celebrate employments, we celebrate a lot, and we are like, okay, come and see. Come and see. So you are not just the administration, you are part of a process, you are part of victories. You can see what it does when it works well. You can be more aware of what it does when it doesn't work, when we don't have the renewals in time. So this is how we, in our very, very small way, fight against bureaucratization and dehumanization. Freedom to self-organize, I will keep for the end, but I would love to say something about community. Moussa, you were talking about collective approach, individual approach, and working on community reconstruction. In our work in the field, we work with, well, in a collective approach. I mean, it's cohort. We are a business. We're not an association, an NGOs, or a foundation. We're a business, okay? So we must have, let's say, volume of action. We must work on a collective model and a collective approach, okay? But we also have to deal with very, very, very customized solution for every one of our collaborators, of our temp workers, of our apprentices. We can't well, it's not employment, it's not directly our core business, so we can't work on rebuilding communities. But what we do is rebuilding families. Because when you are a refugee and you have a job, and, well, you can apply for better housing, and you are hired, well, you can ask for your family to join. And this we do as well, because we know how important it is for our collaborators. It is not our core mission, really. It is something we do because we know that it matters so much for them, and we want to go until the end of the way with them. And it is our way to partly rebuild, not community, but their life in our country. And in the meanwhile, we are working with them to build their life in our community, because our community has its codes, it has its ways of life, its ways of doing, its cultural particularities, and in the professional environment, as well as in the personal environment, it must be dealt with. I'm almost on time and just have one more minute for the narrative. Sandra, you talked about redemption, of overriding the stigmatized immigrant status. And I think this is very, very important. You said that being an entrepreneur is perceived as trendy and cool. Well, in France, if you have a job, you have a status in society, you belong to society, you have a place. You can say, well, when you meet someone, one of the first questions you ask is, okay, and what do you do in life? So what's your job? And it is very important, and it helps to rebuild different narratives, you know, because being a refugee is only an administrative status at one time in a life, okay? It must not be a whole identity, and we work with our collaborators on that point as well, because from day one, when you sign a contract, okay, you are under refugee status with all the difficulties and the challenges and so on, but you are a collaborator, you are a worker, you are a fishmonger, you are a dweller, you are operating in a plant, you are working in digital, you are a cook, you are, and so on and so on. You are someone else than a refugee. And this work on this narrative, I think it's very important to help them to envision the future in a more optimistic way. And I thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is for Madame Raphaëlle Thirion from ADECO. Interesting presentation. But how do you measure your impact on these communities? I mean, in terms of vulnerability, recovering trust, rebuilding the families beyond access to jobs. How do you measure that? Thank you.
Hello. My question is for Anselm. So I happen to be Lebanese and also doing research on Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Very interesting stuff, but I do it from a qualitative perspective, so it's quite a different way of doing it. And my focus was on Syrian refugees in camps in Beirut, near Beirut, Sabra and Shatila. Yeah. I was wondering why you focused on that area in the north, because there's a history of cultural proximity, actually, with the Syrians in that area. So I wonder if that had an impact on pro-sociality. Did you also take into account people's political, religious affiliation, which could very much impact the way they perceive refugees, especially in a country like Lebanon, which has a lot of different factions and different understandings of the situation? Also, I missed when you did this research, because since the economic and financial collapse in Lebanon, there has been a lot of increase, actually, unfortunately, in anti-refugee sentiment, people attributing to them all sorts of issues, including an additional burden on the crumbling infrastructure. So that, I would suspect, has an impact on pro-sociality. And we've seen, actually, unfortunately, recent scenes of Syrians getting kicked out of some cities, actually, in Lebanon, especially in Beirut. So that was my first question. I also have another question for Sandra, a very quick question, and it's really nice to meet you. It's great, but it's very, very positive. So I was wondering, what's the catch there? Did you interview people who are struggling a bit with entrepreneurship? And did that have any impact on, you know, spillovers on their status in the community and in society more generally? Or was it all, did they still have an increase and perceive, you know, entrepreneurship as redemption, even though they were struggling with their venture? Thank you very much.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the presentations. I agree with the observations, and I just wanted to share a strategy that I found particularly helpful. The path to entrepreneurship is really one that requires documents, like you point out, and employers have a huge role to play in helping people get documents. And I think that, you know, you've done remarkable work to illustrate the refugee challenges, but it's also really important to point out how employers can help. For example, even in France, in the United States, you can declare somebody who doesn't have documents. It's a risk for the employer. There are sanctions, but when you consider the potential benefit, you know, in helping somebody integrate, whether it's through learning a language or just being present, you know, I understand that obviously if somebody doesn't speak French, they can't be present at a plant, but they can assist and they can observe. And so I would say one perhaps further avenue might to be sharing this work with big organizations, and telling them that yes, you know, declaring somebody who hasn't yet received their documents is a risk, but that risk can really be mitigated. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that working with labor law experts. So just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Bonjour. First of all, thank you all for your presentation. Bonjour. Better. First of all, thank you all for your coming here and your presentation. I wanted to say something about what Raphaël Thirion was talking about in some problems. For example, you said that for the refugees or migrants, there's a problem when there is about the renewal, which can take a lot of time, and the administrative, how to say, work is a kind of labor by itself. But the problem, as me, I think in 2018, 2019, when I was in filmmaking school, I was writing some documentary about this subject. And what I saw when I was talking with people and being with them is that the most difficult part is to have the status of refugee, or to know, how to say, to have the rights as human being. Once we have this, everything is much more easier. And unfortunately, just to have this status or to know the rights, it can take 1, 2, and even 5 years for some. So I think in this part, there's the biggest problem, because without any rights, they don't have anything. They don't have a job, they don't have a health, and they are not accepted as human beings. So about this, I wanted to ask you if you have a knowledge or if you do some for people before they get the first, how to say, paper, which says about the reality. And voila. And I apologize for my random English, but well, merci. Okay, so I'm Yeroshen Elias. Now I'm in entrepreneurship. Maybe I'll be with you in HEC the next year in the cohort of X entrepreneurship. And I was in filmmaking school before I chose the part of the legal to have a better impact on people. Voilà.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. My name is Mafo, and I come from ESCP, but I'm originally from the United States. So I have a question particularly for Professor Sandra. You talked about how the entrepreneurial mindset can override that stigmatized social status, but I kind of had a question about the motivations. For example, why entrepreneurship specifically? And do you think that there are any outstanding and or lurking factors such as education? I know in the States there's this rising kind of notion about the first generation student, and there's also a lot of programs that are helping that. So do you think that education, like for example, like in this study, did you see the education levels of these business owners, and did that have like a specific impact on their success, as well as them like overriding that kind of stigmatized social status?
Hi, Dan Wong, Columbia Business School. Thank you all for presenting. My question's for Anselm, and I think your question partially answered what I'm about to ask, which is I wanted to learn a little bit more about the host population in which the study took place. I thought your study design was elegant. The treatment effect is clear. And the mechanism analysis was also wonderfully done as well. The emphasis on the contact hypothesis to rule out the other kind of mechanisms was super clear. But what it made me think of was something that in New York has been transpiring over the past year, which is that in New York there have been an increase in the number of asylum seekers that have come from other states, and it presents a kind of research design scenario that's similar to what you're studying. And what's happened is that in New York, various city services have found solutions to house asylum seekers, placing them quasi-randomly in different places across the city to create the situation of social contact. So one would think that in New York that this would produce greater pro-social behavior. There's no study done on this because it was sudden, it was random, and it was exogenous. Based on what I think I read in the news and see and hear, so this is totally anecdotally, it's not obvious that that same effect that you observe is also in New York, which is a little surprising to me as well, because in New York, folks are exposed, just as folks in Paris are, to various forms of diversity, various forms of differences as well. So one would expect that there's a more inclusive and welcoming approach. And so I wonder what the mechanism is that belies contact. Is it kind of a reaction to an exogenous imposition? Is it just differences, or is it something else? And so more information about the host society would be incredibly informative in an otherwise really nicely done study. Thank you.
So I think a last question and then let you guys respond.
Hi, I'm Sophia, an MA student at Sciences Po. Thank you so much for all of your presentations. I have a question for Sandra, and I think it has already been addressed by some other questions. It would be related to the effect of the motivation to engage in entrepreneurship on stigmatization. So, I mean, in the literature, and okay, the effect is not always very clear, but there is a distinction between necessity and opportunity entrepreneurship. So did you see that those who wanted to kind of take an unexplored opportunity in the market, really believed in their product, were more, the effect of a reduction in stigmatization was greater than those who were just pushed into it because they had zero opportunities on the labor market, and they had to engage in entrepreneurship even though they didn't really want to do it. Thank you.
I have a question for Anselm. Can I ask a question?
I will give her.
So when you talk about exposure, I'm trying to understand what you mean by that, because exposure is a spectrum, right? So there's a difference between seeing a refugee or a new immigrant living from across the street and then working with them or sending your children to school with the children of Easterlands. So I just wanted to learn a little bit more, I guess, about how you conceptualize exposure.
Okay, I propose, Anselm, the mic is yours and we go through.
Yeah, thanks so much. These are great questions, and it's almost like peer review, live peer review. So thank you. So why do we choose Northern Lebanon? I think the main reason was that there wasn't that much on it relative to sort of more like Beirut and other areas of Lebanon. But I think, to be perfectly honest, I think that the sort of strategic reason was that you have this variation in Northern Lebanon. You have areas where refugees are housed and other areas where they're not housed. And that's what we always need kind of in the sciences, variation essentially, right? Some people get a treatment, others don't, and that's why we focused on that area. And I think it's important to note because, as you rightly say, it's an area where there has already been exposure, right? So this gets to your question too. There has been exposure for centuries. So I think in a way this effect is all the more surprising. If anything, it might be even larger in other settings because they already had exposure, right? It's almost like testing the effect of a vaccine, and people have already received a little bit of the vaccine in the past. So I think it's, if anything, in this setting, a bit of a lower bound. On the sort of population, I mean, I'll sort of, use the statistical trick to say, well, we keep these kinds of things constant, so religion, age, gender, etc. So this is all controlled. But what is interesting, one thing you can do is like check, are there any differences in these effects across, say, Christian versus Muslim or old versus young? And we don't find that much. So it suggests that this kind of effect that I showed is not just driven by one very specific subset. So for example, I don't know, Christians that just happen to be, have sort of more leeway to be pro-social, or Muslims because they share the same religion. So we didn't find any of that, which I thought was quite interesting. It does raise the question, sorry, I have to pull this up. It does raise the question why it's not the case in New York. I mean, I guess you'd have to do a study on it, and you should, because it sounds a bit... Right. But it would be fantastic. It was super interesting to study it in New York and see what happens. One, just, I don't know, but like one, based on Allport, what he would say is that you need somewhat equal status. And in Northern Lebanon, at least, it's not exactly the same status, but at least for the, centuries before, Syrians, Lebanese, they were kind of on the same level. And then the Civil War, of course, happened. I would think that in New York, it's perhaps a bit different because it's asylum seekers from lots of different parts of the world in a very, rich city. So maybe that plays a difference, that the status is just too different, just sort of borrowing from Allport. I should caution in any of these studies, and this is data from 4 years ago, so the sort of recent effects are not in there. And this is why, of course, you would want to redo these studies all the time because all these contextual factors change. And now with the explosion, that's one thing. The Civil War sort of ebbing off might be another factor that could change these things. Yeah, so more studies to be done. And so on exposure, maybe just lastly, this is just, distance essentially. So there are very nice experimental studies where they vary. Do you work with them? How often do you see them, et cetera, et cetera? And so you can really drill down. In this case, it's really just, is there a housing nearby? That's really what it is. Yeah. Thank you.
Have any questions? You did? No. Can't remember.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So let's see. So someone mentioned that you need papers for path to entrepreneurship, you need documents. So actually in the United States, you do not. You do not need papers to become an entrepreneur. So this is very interesting because there is discrimination in the labor market for people who do not have papers. So of course, employers are not gonna take the risk to hire them. But if you wanna start a corporation or an NGO or any type of corporation, you can, because since 1996, the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, basically the people who take care of taxes in the US, they offer this ITIN number, Identification Taxpayer Number, that allows for people to start their own businesses. So this is a unique, America is exceptional. So this is a unique case because it really allows them, right, to start their own businesses, to hire US citizens, to hire whoever they want to hire. Why education levels in business owners? So we are looking at age also, because we see differences between people who have had DACA. DACA is a Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals temporary permit that the United States gives to people who have finished high school in the US or who have migrated at a certain age. And we definitely see differences between people who came to the US older and remain undocumented, and people who are undocumented but who experienced DACA, fell out of DACA, or simply are younger. But we're not very sure yet how that plays a role, but that's something that we're thinking about. There are a lot of negative things about being undocumented. Going back to, it's hard for me to see from far, but you. So I used to be undocumented, right? And I work with fake papers. And I chose to focus on the positive because as a person, as a scholar, and as a sociologist, I was tired of seeing the problems, and this is why I migrated to management. Now I want to think about solutions, right? I want to think about how we can make the experiences for marginalized populations better. And so this is, of course, there's variation in our data. There are people who experience very, very negative experiences, but we're focusing on these mechanisms that allow them to kind of grow, as you mentioned, from this marginalized status and feeling very low levels of dignity, and what allowed them to become business owners, but also gain social status in their ethnic networks. So, yeah, I don't know if I'm missing. Thank you.
Thank you. You were asking, how do you measure your impact beyond access to job, correct? The kind of KPIs we follow are housing mainly. How many people we are able to provide with stable and long-term housing solutions. That is one thing. We are following also driving license, healthcare. We are following family reunions. But beyond that, we don't, because it is not our job, basically. It is not part of our mission. We try to contribute in our own way to having an impact on community, on their personal life. But basically, we are part of a multinational. We are part of the ADECO group. Our mission is to train, to find jobs, to provide social support for these people to remain in their jobs. And we don't have the time or the resources to measure beyond that. From time to time, they come back to us and say hello and present their wives or children or give news, and we are very happy about that. But it is the exception, and we're like, okay, if they don't come back to us, it means that basically everything's fine, because they knew and they know that if anything should go wrong, we would of course, we would be there for them even if they are not collaborators anymore, such things. But to answer your question, we don't measure much beyond housing, driving license, mobility, and healthcare for the social part. About administrative renewal delays and other administrative joys in France. Of course, the situation for asylum seekers is absolutely terrible, and of course some of them can wait until 5 years to get their papers in order to get the country protection, and some of them don't get this protection like ever. But it doesn't mean that all difficulties are off from this point. I mean, it means that they end a journey, the asylum seeker journey, and they begin another one, the refugee journey, which is full of administrative trap as well, because there is this renewal delays things, which is very impactful, but you have also all which is linked with social security, employment agencies, and other administrative approaches in the, and paperwork that you have to do in order to be considered in the country. And when your language level is not that good, I mean, have you opened recently a Pôle emploi or an employment agency page? Because if you don't get the administrative vocabulary, you're lost. I mean, have you opened the Amélie page? If you don't get vocabulary, you're lost. So you need plenty of help on this side as well. And we do the job first. We do it for them, opening, subscribing, applying, and so on. But what we do as well is to teach them how to, is to teach them this vocabulary, these processes, in order for them to gain autonomy. But really, this is a whole different journey, and they have to deal with it, and they have to learn to cope with these kind of difficulties as well.
Okay, so thank you so much. It's time for a break now. We have a break until 11:15, so we start again at 11:15. Before we go, please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their work. And thank you also for being so engaged and asking questions. So keep it up after the break. So thanks.